This week's lecture, the last for the semester, outlines the challenges to the Soviet system that precipitated the end of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe and led to the collapse of communism in Europe as a whole. The revolutions in 1989 set the stage for the continued unification of Europe and the end of the Cold War. By the 1970s, the Cold War had run its course. After a series of proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, the United States and Soviet Union entered a period of diplomacy known as détente. The end of the economic miracle contributed to this decision between the superpowers as the price of oil skyrocketed after a decision by OPEC to raise its price. Détente meant arms limitations, and the two countries agreed to limit nuclear weapons. But more important were the Helsinki Accords, in which all of the European states agreed to recognize the existing borders that after World War II and basic human rights, including the freedom of conscience and expression. The Helsinki Accords led to renewed challenges to the Soviets in both Poland and Czechoslovakia. In Poland, the Solidarity movement was a response to the collapse of the Polish economy in the mid-1970s, and workers sought better wages and living conditions. However, labor unions were illegal under communist regimes, so Solidarity leaders were arrested. Solidarity was aided by the continued presence of Catholicism in Polish society. Catholicism provided a base for resistance to communism, which was bolstered by the election of John Paul II, a Pole, as Pope. John Paul was an outspoken critic of communism, and his visit to Poland, as shown here, galvanized the Solidarity movement. The Polish government responded by implementing martial law to prevent a Soviet invasion in 1980. In Czechoslovakia, the dissident movement took a more artistic form rather than labor form. Musicians, poets, and playwrights led protests against the communist regime, manifest in what was called Charter 77, which called on the Czechoslovakian government to recognize the rights guaranteed by the Helsinki Accords. The leader that emerged from this movement was Václav Havel. In the Soviet Union, a change in leadership again altered the direction of the Cold War, as Mikhail Gorbachev became premier in 1985. Almost immediately, he encountered a crisis with the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl, forcing him to reorganize the Soviet system. His two policies, Glasnost and Perestroika, were attempts to save the Soviet system. In 1989, Gorbachev revoked the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified intervention in communist states. Once the threat of the Soviet military was removed, the communist states quickly collapsed in the summer and fall of 1989. First with elections in Poland that saw the Solidarity movement take power, then the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, in which Václav Havel was peacefully made the new leader of a post-communist state, and finally the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. The end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism in Europe brought new questions, but the credit for its end is often divided into four categories. The first interpretation underscores the importance of United States President Ronald Reagan in forcing the Soviets to spend on military expansion, effectively exhausting the economic capabilities of the Soviet Union. The second emphasizes the acts of Gorbachev in peacefully accepting the end of the Cold War and not using the Soviet military to maintain control in Eastern Europe. Still, a third interpretation recognizes the bravery of Europeans in protesting against their states, leading to their inevitable collapse. And the last interpretation assumes the superiority of democracy and the inevitable fall of communism. This idea is at the heart of Fukuyama's essay, which you're reading for this week.